Welsh Landscape. To live in Wales is to be conscious at dusk of the spilled blood that went to the making of the wild sky, dyeing the immaculate rivers in all their courses. It is to be aware above the noisy tractor and hum of the machine, of strife in the strung woods, vibrant with sped arrows. You cannot live in the present, at least not in Wales. There is the language, for instance, the soft consonants strange to the ear. There are cries in the dark at night as owls answer the moon, and thick ambush of shadows hush at the field's corners. There is no present in Wales, and no future. There is only the past, brittle with relics, wind-bitten towers and castles with sham ghosts, mouldering quarries and mines, and an impotent people, sick with inbreeding, worrying the carcass of an old song.
She was all that. I don't think R.S. Thomas ever expected to get a laugh, but he has to. A great poet with a very pessimistic view of the Welsh landscape, and a view, it has to be said, from a considerable time ago. And I think one of the interesting things in our discussion today will be to see how many of us still have that kind of pessimistic view of Wales, and to what extent we see the landscape in different ways. It strikes me that the landscape, above almost any other subject in poetry and art and music and the other art forms, is one that is capable of multiple interpretations. It has different meanings for us at different times. And it does so not just in art, but of course also in our own personal relationships, each of us with the landscape. Sometimes it's nothing but rain. Sometimes it's a place to grow crops. Sometimes for an architect or a landscape architect, it's a place to change, a place to develop, to make your own. We have landscapes in Wales that are home. We have landscapes in Wales that seem foreign and strange. And this diversity was brought home to me really this year when I've been curating two very different exhibitions about aspects of Welsh landscape. The first one was earlier in the year at Moma Machynlleth, and it was called Romanticism in the Welsh Landscape. And that exhibition explored three generations, three different periods across the generations of artists responding to Wales and its landscape. Artists from Wales like Richard Wilson and Kerry Richards, and artists from away who encountered in something in Wales that they found very strange and very unexpected, which turned their art upside down. People like Graham Sutherland and John Piper and J.M.W. Turner. And at the moment, I've been curating an exhibition with a completely different approach to landscape by four artists whose work is showing currently down on the Mice in the Eisteddfod. And if you haven't been, do go down to see the Eisteddfod and to see this exposition. That's the French word, isn't it? Which is in the Lle Celf, the art tent, as tent's not the best word, but it's the one we use. And as part of it, you'll see this exhibition, which of historic works painted by four artists, Joan Baker, Charles Burton, John Elwyn, and Abergavenny's own Bert Isaac, between the 1930s and the 1950s. And all of them took a very realist approach to landscape. They were four artists who were really committed to finding ways of describing their own environment, the place around them. And I think all of them did it not with the sublime qualities of Turner or Piper, or with the surreal excitement of Sutherland, say, or Kerry Richards, but they did it with an intent to be honest in describing the place that they were They wanted to be able to say, the landscape on our doorstep is as fit a subject for art as any exotic place or any historic theme. And they did it. And going back to those pictures from the 1940s, 50s and 60s, not just 40s and 50s now, I think brings home the quality of what they were doing and a wonderful evocation of the Welsh landscape as it then was. And it points up for me the idea of the landscape as being exceptional, as some of the visiting artists have seen it, and the landscape as being ordinary, as some of the insider artists have seen it. The exhibition was inspired by Abergavenny's own Raymond Williams and his novel Border Country, and I just thought I'd read a short section about his view of landscape, which to me brings out very clearly the ways in which all of us see landscape in different ways at different times, but certainly the way that Raymond Williams, as a great cultural historian and critic, did. And he's talking here about the arrival of his characters, Harry and Ellen Price, just married, coming to the village of Glynmawr, where they're going to make a home, based on Pandy, 6 miles north of here. Once they were up on the road, Harry and Ellen could look out over the valley and the village in which they had come to live. To the east stood the Holy Mountain, the blue peak with the southern rockfall on its western scarp. From the mountain to the north ran a ridge of high ground, and along it the grey Marcher castles. And there he's talking about the grandeur of the landscape, but also some of its historical layers, its deep past. And he goes on. To a stranger, Glynmawr would seem not a village, but just thinly populated farming country. Along the road where Harry and Ellen walked, there were no lines of houses, no sudden centres of life. There were a few isolated houses by the roadside, and occasionally under trees a group or patch of 5 or 6. Then lanes opened from the road to east and west, making their way to other small groups at varying distances. To the east, under the wooded ridge, lay Cefn, Penydre, Trefedu, Campston. To the west, under the wall of the mountains, stood Glynant, Cwmhonddu, the Pandy, the bridge, Panteg. The village was the valley, the whole valley, these scattered groups brought together in a name. And then, finally, a section as they continue their walk up to the places that's going to be their home, and experiencing some of these significant points in the landscape, which are just the kinds that the artists in the exhibition down there, and I'm sure many poets also, have responded to in trying to understand and record and interpret the landscape. Walking the road in the October evening, they felt on their faces their own country, the huddled farmhouses with their dirty yards, the dogs under the weed-growing walls, the cattle-marked crossings from the sloping field under the orchard, the long fields in the line of the valley where the cattle pastured, the turned red earth of the small, thickly hedged ploughland, the brooks, alder-lined, curving and meeting, the bracken-heaped tussocky fields up the mountain where the sheep were scattered under the wood-shaded barns, the occasional white wall direct towards the sun, standing out where its windows caught the light across the valley, the high black line of the mountains, and the ring of the sheep wall. At the end, past the grey school and the master's cottage, they could hear the river as it came towards the road, and soon they could see it, fast flowing and stone-strewn below them. And there ahead was the first chapel, alder-shaded, and beyond it the other chapel, larger and better built, its graveyard tidier. The lane ran up steeply from the road, and from its high banks the trees arched over. They turned up the lane and climbed steadily. Then round a long curve, the pitch eased away, and the tree line opened. The patch of 8 houses lay ahead, set so that looking to the north and west, the spurs of the mountains lay open in the distance. Harry stopped, put down the leather box, and looked round. So from Raymond Williams, the insider, writing about this very landscape in the late 1950s and talking of a time earlier again, we'll go to 3 other contributors, poets, artist and art historian, I should say, to give their own interpretations of this theme of inspiration from the Welsh landscape. We'll start with Owen Sheers.
Oh, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn, and croeso. I'm glad that you kind of sniggered at the end of that R.S. Thomas poem, because it's always a poem that I really haven't liked, which is strange because he's a poet who is a fantastic poet who's always been a very important influence for me. But I've got a very clear memory of when I was 18, actually. I wrote on that poem in my exams, and I can remember finishing my essay with the argument that there was only one person here who was worrying the carcass of an old song, and it wasn't the Welsh people. But the main reason that I've never liked that poem is not because of the poetry, but because of how, for me, it's halfway towards being a true landscape poem, because this idea that you can only live in the past in Wales immediately, for me, sort of misses the mark in terms of landscape. Because when it comes to landscape, what I'm interested in really is us, because landscape only happens when we turn up. Before we do, there is just environment, be that natural or built environment. It's only through our looking, the human perception, that landscape is brought into being. And because of that, all landscapes hold both the past and the present. And in terms of landscape in art and poetry, that is what always interests me. The fact that landscape holds us then and now because we have seen it, and not just us, but all of the previous generations who have seen it. It is rich with association and metaphor. And because of that, in the best landscape poetry and the best landscape art, what you get is the past and the present, but also the old and the new. I think it was Emerson who said, "The moving of the boughs in the storm is both new to me and old." And also the strange and the familiar, and something that Seamus Heaney has written extensively on, that idea of the sensed and the known. And it's all of these opposites, all of these contradictions in many ways, that I think the artist is bringing to that moment when they try to, or attempt to, render a landscape. But they can only do that because the landscape holds so much of us already. I'm not actually going to say too much more now about my thoughts on landscape, partly because I'm not entirely sure what they are, to be honest. I compiled this anthology called A Poet's Guide to Britain, and I really did that as part of an exploration to try to understand my own relationship with landscape. And I suppose some of what I've just said were some of the conclusions that I came to. But on the whole, a lot of how landscape works upon us, both the exterior landscape and, of course, the interior landscape. Nan Shepherd famously wrote about how the mountain has an interior landscape as well as that exterior landscape. How that works upon us and how we work upon landscape remains something of a mystery to me. And I think as a writer, that's how it should be. Because you write into those spaces of unknowing, you write in order to understand. And quite often I think you will write something that might be called a landscape poem, but that wasn't necessarily your intention. But the landscape has become the conduit, really, has become the vehicle to carry something else that you want to say. So for the rest of my 5 minutes, I'm just going to read 3 short poems. And the first is a poem called Sguryd Fawr, in a book that I called Sguryd Hill. So I can't pretend the landscape isn't important to me. As I'm sure most of you know, Sguryd Fawr is one of the 7 hills around Abergavenny. We like to think of them as being a bit like the 7 hills of Rome. And it's also known as the Holy Mountain. It's particularly rich in myth and association. And one of those myths is referred to at the very start of this poem. Just like the farmers who once came to scoop handfuls of soil from her holy scar, so I am still drawn to her back for the answers to every question I have never known. To the sentence of her slopes, the blunt wind glancing from her withers, to the split view she reveals with every step along her broken spine. This edge of her cleft palate, part hill, part field, rising from a low mist, a lonely hulk adrift through Wales, her east-west flanks, one dark, one sunlit, her vernacular of borders, her weight, the unspoken words of an unlearned tongue. This next poem is about the landscape of the Lake District, where, as I'm sure you know, the lower hills are called fells. And I wrote it in memory of somebody called Robert Woolf, who was in charge of the Wordsworth Trust when I was based up there for 18 months. And shortly after I left the Trust, very sadly, Robert Woolf died. And his funeral was an extraordinary an occasion, because it was one of those funerals that was genuinely a celebration of a very unusual life, well lived, and of course a moment of great sadness. And towards the end of the funeral, something happened in that landscape within which Robert Woolf had lived and had interrogated via, especially via the work of the poets, which seemed to me to be a fantastic example of those moments when sometimes environment and landscape and the moment can find the language that sometimes we can't. It's called The Light Fell. The weather had been confused all day, so who can say why it was just then that the light fell that way, the sun riding low to burnish the tops of the hills for a minute, no more, against a curtain of cloud that was ashen with snow. Or why it was then that the deer chose to show their faces, lift their heads from grazing, step near, then pause before coming on again. Oh, human life, mysterious, I heard a woman say. Not gone, not gone. There's electrics, you know. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it to be so. And as the light fell, drew our eyes, a thinning seam of amber between the land and sky, I could believe it too. That your guiding hand had motion still and influence among these hills to light the crag and Michael's vale just so, according to your will. And as the soil hit the wood and the gathered crowd moved, said what they could, wished well and farewell, that it was just as much you as the still lowering sun, throwing one flank of this valley dark and leaving the other lit to illustrate, as the land here always did, what we'd but sensed within ourselves. How at once and from the very same source a light could rise as the same light fell. I'm going to finish with a poem about Wales by another Thomas, Edward Thomas. It's not really narrowing it down, saying that it's a Welsh poet called Thomas, is it really? It's, and this is called The Mountain Chapel, and I guess I wanted to read this because something else that I've found that especially landscape poetry and to a certain extent landscape art has done for me is to continue changing that dialogue of looking and receiving, in that a good piece of landscape poetry will change the way that you feel and that you think about that kind of landscape quite often for the rest of your life. And I've been spending a lot of time recently up at Capel y Ffin and around that wonderful mountain church and the mountain chapel up there. And every time I've gone up there, I've been made to think of Edward Thomas's poem, The Mountain Chapel. So I'll finish with this. Chapel and gravestones, old and few, are shrouded by a mountain fold from sound and view of life. The loss of the brook's voice falls like a shadow. All they hear is the eternal noise of wind whistling in grass, more shrill than aught as human as a sword, and saying still, 'tis but a moment since man's birth, and in another moment more man lies in earth forever. But I am the same now and shall be, even as I was before he came. Till there is nothing, I shall be. Yet there the sun shines afternoon so cheerfully the place almost seems peopled, nor lacks cottage chimney, cottage hearth. It is not more in size than is a cottage, and less than any other empty home in homeliness. It has a garden of wild flowers and finest grass and gravestones warm in sunshine hours the year through. Men behind the glass stand once a week singing and drown the whistling grass their ponies munch. And yet, somewhere near or far off, there's some man could live happy here. Or one of the gods, perhaps, were they not of inhuman stature dire, as poets say, who have not seen them clearly, if at any sound of any wind of the world in grass blades stiff, they would not startle and shudder cold under the sun. When gods were young, this wind was old. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. I should have explained at the beginning what the format is for this, that we're going to have each of the four contributors, as I did, saying something about their own feelings about inspiration of the landscape. And then we're going to throw it open to questions and discussion, so be ready for that. Next up is Llywelyn Hall.
Welsh Landscape, for me, that particular poem, I don't quite see it as a bleak poem, actually. I find that, first of all, it's not populated, so you don't have the inhabitants of that landscape which he's describing. He's specifically saying it's a Welsh one, and then he goes on to tell us that it's actually a place where it's so overbearing, the history and the fabric of it. It's so overbearing when you're in it, when you're immersed in it. It takes over you, and it gives you no space really to progress. But for me, for a painter's point of view, I quite like that, because I think that what it's saying is it's timeless, and that its place is so potent that you don't have to try and be a pioneer. You don't have to try and wrestle with its motifs. It's there, and it's so ever present. And in a way, it gives me then license to then go into the poem and extrapolate sort of images from it. So the images you see around here are images which I've been making since I've been listening to RS's poetry, a late recording, probably about 50 or 60 different readings. And I found myself thinking that what these aren't about the actual poem in a literal sense, but they are about the places where perhaps he would have gone for a walk, or I imagined him leaving these houses, the chapel and the places, the people he'd visit, and the people of which he made these very cute sort of portrayals of. And I felt myself sort of, it allowed me then to go out and to explore the landscape with a sort of a license, which I didn't have before. And I think when you paint the landscape, it's such a great subject, it's a monumental subject, which is hugely buried in its past, if you like. And you're up against these huge giants of sort of image making, which for a painter is a difficult thing to then approach and come at it with from a fresh angle. But with RS, I think the great thing about him is that because it's the internal world he explores, and the spiritual world, he translates his relationship with the landscape into his spirituality, and that comes through all the time, I think. And then I felt particularly that I could then go out and make these images, which, as I say, have no literal relationship to his work, but I was listening to them the whole time, and they charge you, I think. And as I say, the spirituality is extremely powerful and forthright, and that really for me is my relationship with him as a poet. Yeah, and again, it's this issue of how do you then search for a motif in the landscape, and of course you go out there and you find that, as Owen says, it doesn't exist until you go out for a walk amongst it and sort of involve yourself and engage with it. So with RS, I think that what he does for me is he unlocks this inner world. It's in the sanctum which you can get when you're immersed in this geology and this fabric of this land, and it becomes your story, and you have to put yourself in it, and then that becomes as fresh and as new and as vigorous as it ever was. That's my stance.
Thank you, Dan. Lots of food for discussion there. Peter Lord.
Pnawn da chi gyd, diolch yn fawr am ddod, braf iawn gael cymryd ohonoch chi yma. I'm going to tell you a story. It concerns two painters, a Welsh landscape and a bloody row. The first painter was Martin Bloch, a German Jewish emigre, came over just before the Second World War. who spent time working in the slate mining districts of Gwynedd around Bangor. I'm sure you know that. The other painter was Joseph Herman, Polish Jewish emigre, came over in 1940, and from 1944 lived and worked in Abergavenny, was there for over a decade. Bloch was the older man by a generation and a very distinguished painter when he first arrived in London, in fact, where he set up an art school during the war, and Herman was one of the other painters who attended that art school. But they became good friends, the two of them. And in the summer of 1949, Bloch visited Herman at Abergavenny. They went for a walk one very hot afternoon. Went out for a walk and decided to draw. This is Herman's account of what happened next. Martin, having found a motif, pulled his bleached beret as low as his eyebrows and sat down comfortably for a few hours' honest work. I went my way. When I returned from my wanderings, Martin was still busy with some trees in the foreground. I looked over his shoulder, and what I did then, no painter should ever do if he cherishes his friendship. I hurriedly looked at the motif and at the drawing Martin had almost finished and flared up. Here, in front of me, was a landscape with all the suggestions of a bleak and serene existence, and this man here had put an artistic distance between himself and this existence. What are all the bright-coloured shapes in aid of? What sense is there in a tiny blue tip sitting passively against a yellow sky? Doesn't he know the meaning of a tip? And those red shadows? I drew the motif in my sketchbook and shouted incoherently in my unfair fury. Martin paid me the compliment of not pitying me and shouted back. He too lost his temper. He too had something to defend. You're talking literature, not drawing, said he. You're looking, but you're not consulting your eyes. Social history is one thing and painting is another thing, and don't confuse the two. How else will you render warmth and light? And then he went on telling me how in nature, as in painting, order means everything, and that physical facts are not to be tampered with, are only to be understood and rendered. He looked at my scribble and shrugged his shoulders. Later, I completed a painting out of that unfortunate motif. It turned out to be the blackest painting I ever did. In fact, Bloch saw the painting later in London and wrote to Herman, I've seen the picture. You are a forlorn romantic. It was a hot day. Well, I'm with Herman. I'm with Herman, who was neither romantic nor forlorn. Landscape, for me, is a function of human culture, very much as Owen was saying. It has no detached reality, which it is the painter's job to render. In the first place, it has been formed or reformed, if you like, by humans. And in the second place, as Owen said, it's only ever comprehended in terms of the cultural baggage which humans bring to it. We cannot set that aside, and indeed, we should not try to do so. To seek to reduce the evidence of human culture to an objective reality, to be rendered in terms of an aesthetic agenda, whether it's Bloch's sort of late Fauvist agenda or the Reverend Gilpin's 18th century picturesque, to do that is, to me, simply immoral. Landscape is the site of human activity, and for almost the whole of the history of Western art, an important point, it has been understood and depicted as such. Pure landscape, inverted commas, as the expression goes, is an aberration of the later 18th and 19th centuries. It's of particular concern to us in Wales because a disproportionate amount of the development work on that rather strange idea was carried on here, at least as far as English art is concerned. Now, sadly, art history in general has identified the progenitor of this way of looking as the Welsh painter Richard Wilson. The expression is the father of English landscape painting. I notice, interestingly, the father of British landscape painting lately, a sort of PC version of what they actually mean. But anyway, there we are. The interesting thing is that the earliest version of that expression is in fact devoid of the element of cultural appropriation, since it was coined by a Welsh painter, Edward Pugh, in the late 18th century. He says Wilson is the father of modern landscape painting, which is something rather different. And I can take that because Wilson can, in fact, correctly, in my view, be understood as a progenitor of Joseph Herman, but he certainly can't be understood as a progenitor of Martin Bloch. Wilson presented landscape as the site of human activity. He adapted it, or selected it, tampered with it, to use Bloch's pejorative expression. And he did so in order to bring it into harmony with the idea about social or political organisation that he or his clients wished to promote. Sometimes the narrative is very explicit, as in the destruction of the children of Niobe, which is the work for which he was significantly best known in his own time. Sometimes the message is presented by him in terms of allusion, in the certain knowledge that the audience that he was addressing would understand the cultural reference. You see that in the Castelltinas Bran from Llangollen, or in the Speculum Dianae, which is the painting which you see Dolbaden Castle transferred, relocated into northern Italy. Now, none of that is to say that Wilson didn't enjoy working directly from nature, and that he was not among, indeed, the earlier painters who took to painting out of doors rather than simply sketching or drawing. He actually painted out of doors, we know that. But as Ruskin pointed out, he couldn't for the life of him draw trees, for the simple reason that he never looked at one. That's what Ruskin says, and I think he's right. That is to say, looked with the intention of rendering it in a manner that revealed whether it was a beech or a birch. For Wilson, tree is tree. And his painting outdoors was a means to an end, not an end in itself. So I'm with Wilson too, as well as Herman, and as far as I'm concerned, to hell with all that vacuous, immoral humbug about the beautiful and the sublime that came afterwards, and to me, the facile speculations of idle aristocratic connoisseurs made rich by the oppression of the poor in the later 18th century. A landscape is indeed a map of social history, and all moral landscape painting is narrative, the revelation of human culture through its interaction with place. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And finally, Paul Henry. Finally, for now.
Well, I'm just going to draw us back to the interior landscape that Owen referred to as well. I mean, I suppose what makes the Welsh landscape so fascinating for a small country is that no single poem or painting can nail it. It's too diverse. And with this in mind, I'd just like to share a few thoughts about how outer landscape becomes an inner one, certainly in my own poems and in those of finer poets. Years ago, I became quite excited by a Seamus Heaney essay on Patrick Kavanagh, and it was called The Placeless Heaven, Another Look at Kavanagh. And Heaney, in his essay, talking about Kavanagh's later poems, and that's in the mid-20th century I'm talking about, Heaney says, when he writes about places now, they are luminous spaces within his mind. They've been evacuated of their status as background, as documentary geography, and exist instead as transfigured images, sites where the mind projects its own force. And Heaney opens his essay by recalling his own childhood farm. Both poets grew up on farms, and a chestnut tree that an aunt of his planted in the year Heaney was born, in 1939. And then he explains how in his early teens the family moves away from the farm and the new incumbents cut down every tree in the yard, including the chestnut tree. And then in his essay, Heaney goes on, and I paraphrase, a couple of years ago I began to think of the space where the tree had been, or would have been. In my mind's eye, I saw it as a kind of luminous emptiness, a warp and waver of light, and in a way that I found hard to define, I began to identify with that space, as years before I had identified with the young tree. It was not so much a matter of attaching oneself to a living symbol of being rooted in the native ground. It was more a matter of some transparent yet indigenous afterlife. The new place was all idea, generated out of my experience of the old place, not a topographical location, It was and remains an imagined realm, a placeless heaven rather than a heavenly place. But what really excited me about the Heaney essay was that it mirrored my own and experience of the Welsh landscape, and it kind of validated it. I mean, in my late teens, I lived in Llangors, in the village of Llangors, and I used to climb Cocket Hill on Mynydd Llangors, the most westerly range of the Black Mountains. And to the west of the hill are these spectacular views that some of us here may have seen of Llyn Sefyddan, Llangors Lake, and Pen y Fan and the range, dyeing the immaculate rivers in all their courses, as the R.S. Thomas poem says. But what kept pulling me back up that hill was what I called in an early poem the perfect Y of a dead tree on the eastern side of the ridge, in the quieter, less dramatic Sorghum Valley. And this tree stood in the cleft between Mynydd Troed and Mynydd Llangors. And about it, the light and shade of 4 fields altered. And there was a rock on the mountain. I sometimes feel I wasted all my youth sitting on the rock, staring at this tree for hours. And I didn't want to go up to it. I didn't actually know what species, breed of tree it was. But its dead bark was white, like a brilliant light conductor, and that you could fixate on it, and its open arms generated a light for writing. And basically I wrote out of that tree's light. And when this tree, much to my horror, was cut down, like Heaney's, I also began writing out of an acute sense of absence, out of the space where the tree had been, the inner Welsh landscape, which felt and still feels very real to me. I have a similar inner writing place. It's a patch of sand on the beach in New Quay, Ceredigion, which I first encountered about 1965 as a young child. And from that patch of sand also emanates a particular writing light, a light of absence that I revisit. So finally for me, and with another nod to R.S. Thomas, there is neither a present nor a past in Wales. Time and place are compressed into the lyric moment, a very private Welsh landscape. Amen.
Thank you all very much. Now it's over to the audience. I might get started with a question, which I'm going to ask for over here, so that they speak in this direction rather than talking to me close up. Which is, do any of you want to comment on where the modern is in the landscape in art and poetry? Are we still looking to some of R.S. Thomas's ancient references in the landscape more than we are looking at the intrusion, the new, the optimistic, the redevelopment?
I think we probably are, but I think that we shouldn't be. And it's interesting that you refer to it as a possible intrusion, because, as Paul just said, quite rightly, at the end of his piece there, to touch upon the private quality of landscape, I think is absolutely key. So if you're an 18-year-old who's been brought up in Port Talbot and that's all that you've known, even though you can see that beautiful landscape underneath everything that has happened there, the M4 and the BP chemicals in the past and Tata Steel, it might be that whatever happens next is the intrusion upon your landscape. But I think, I'd be very happy for someone to say that this isn't the case, but I'd argue that probably filmically we're probably further down that road in terms of acknowledging that, although when we say landscape, we see natural landscape, that actually, in terms of Wales, even though so much of the country is still rural, in terms of the population, and in terms of that perception, which is where landscape is formed, the majority of people now, I think, live within built-up areas. So we need to kind of broaden our frame of reference. I'd argue in poetry and art, but I'm not as well versed in the contemporary art of Wales, so I'm very ready to be told. that I'm wrong.
No,
It's not my dad who does that same.
I think the renewal of it, and the new and the modern, is the personal discovery of it. So the physical discovery of that landscape. So, as you know, as you brought up through wherever you happen to be born, or what sort of life you've had, whether it be a rural one or a suburban or urban, there are still more places than you can ever possibly discover in terms of landscape. So the new and the modern is in your personal discovery of it, and I think that's a constant thing. I mean, that's never changed. It's as much current as it has since the beginning of time, and that in itself means that we can all sit back and take a deep breath out and think, well, our position of renewal is in either writing about making pages about it, and as I was saying earlier, the pressure of having to be a pioneer or how to carve out sort of new modernism from it. Is unnecessary, and I don't think it ever was necessary. I think that maybe one or two images and poems and bits of prose maybe broke the boundaries, but that was only in its own craft, not from the landscape as a muse. The subjects we look at and we wrestle with have always been there, and all it is a sense of personal discovery of the landscape.
Well, it's interesting people talking about the artist's perception of the landscape. I'm quite interested in the audience's perception of the artist's perception of the landscape. That's slightly different. I mean, maybe it's because painters are under more immediate pressure to sell their paintings. I mean, I know that there's no point, well, perhaps there is a point in writing poetry if it doesn't get published, I don't know, but there's certainly no point in painting paintings unless people see them. From my point of view. So the audience reception is quite interesting, and I was just thinking, because we were talking about RS, that RS, of course, has, or at least early RS Thomas, has a corollary in painting as Cuffin Williams. And of course, the two men knew each other right till the end of their lives, and they didn't die very long ago, you know. I remember both of them quite well, vividly. And of course, Cuffin Williams was by a mile the most successful, commercially successful Welsh painter ever, including Richard Wilson, who I was talking about. You know, there was a period when I was doing my research originally when it wasn't a sort of Welsh-speaking middle-class home that I went into, which didn't have a Cuffin on the wall. They became a token of something very special, and it was that token of that people. It's why, in general, people like early RS rather than late RS, because all that symbolism's there, and it's very much backward-looking. I mean, it is very much about this sort of, you know, to use the word, hiraeth, about something which allegedly was there and which has gone. So, anyway, the point is about the audience perception, reception of these things, rather than what you guys as poets are actually saying and feeling. It's what's coming back to you which interests me.
Yeah, it's interesting. What came back to me when I showed the poem by coincidence less than a month ago to a group of school children in Newbridge in South Wales, and asked them if they recognised their country in the poem, and they didn't.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I felt quite uplifted, actually. But then, I should say that there was a project that Owen and I were involved in North Wales, Blaen y Ffestiniog, and the photographer Zed Nelson had not been to Wales before, and he came to take some photographs of Blaen y Ffestiniog and the surrounding area. And for him, he actually concluded that here was a place that was between past and present. You know, it was kind of so. I mean, I think the problem with the modern tag is that it's synonymous, certainly in poetry, with the urban rather than the rural, and yet, you know, far more difficult to reinvent a leaf or a mountain in verse than it is to kind of lap up the rich imagery of the city.
Yeah, the other thing is, of course, again, something Owen said is that slag heaps or the M4 going past Port Talbot, whatever it is, no, actually the steelworks, you know, which is something which in a way is almost in the past now. Certainly the slag heaps in Blaen are something in the past, but they are present. You know, it's the narrative of them. I mean, they are there, and if you grow up a lad or a young lady in Blaen, that is your, you know, you're living with that past slap bang in front of you all the time. You know.
The artists in the exhibition down on the Mice, were painting what they saw on their doorsteps, and so if it was new they painted it, if it was old they painted it, if it was a reference to something of historic interest they painted it, but if it was simply a day's work, it appeared in their paintings.
Peter, can I bang on about that a little bit? Because they do go and see that exhibition, fantastic show. But it's a particularly interesting show to me. I haven't read Peter's catalogue yet, so I don't know what he says about it, but that group of works is part of a larger group of works which actually got defined as a Welsh school by John Petts, David Bell and people, art intellectuals in the 1950s, who were looking to create, after the war, some Welsh school. And they call it Welsh environmentalism. It's quite actually moving, the way they describe their aspiration for this work. Of course, what they were doing was, Cuffin was another one, pulling in all that amazing generation of painters that came after the war, Brenda Chamberlain, Vera Bassett, all these people, amazing people. But that was quite interesting because they tried to create out of that a coherent Welsh school which encompassed everything from people painting slag heaps in Blaena to Joan Baker painting The Lady in the Shop down the road in Cardiff. You know, so it's quite an interesting exhibition from that particular point of view. Do go and see it.
Well, we've got a lot of very knowledgeable people in the audience. I happen to recognise at least 4 very respected landscape painters, including one who's painted the Severn Bridge, which is not exactly an ancient monument yet. But let me throw it open to some questions.
I'm one of the children in the 60s, was at art school and subsequently went on to paint and so forth.
The question is stand up, please, for those of us in the back. Thank you.
I apologise. I was a child of the 60s. I'm saying that I went to art college and painted pictures and so forth in that period and have done since. But I remember being very influenced by John Berger and his, I think the book was called Ways of Seeing.
Ways of Seeing. Got it written down.
Which sort of blew my mind a bit at the time.
And mine.
And in a way, I still think it's very beneficial, particularly to this sort of a discussion, because it looks at a sort of social element, social background, which I think we haven't really touched on.
In Ways of Seeing, Berger has an essay, Stanley, because I don't want to overwhelm you, but in Ways of Seeing, Berger has an essay about Joe Herman, in which he accuses Herman of painting one of the most radical and revolutionary sections of the proletariat as if they were agricultural labourers or the labouring poor or something on the land. You know, he has a real go at him, and the irony is, of course, that Herman would say, "Yep, dead right, mate." You know, that's exactly what he was doing, because he was creating, he was dignifying labour. He wasn't painting miners, he wasn't painting agricultural labourers. He was painting the idea of human dignity regained after the fall by labour. So they actually come from the same place. But yeah, but Berger's Ways of Seeing is very, very relevant to this whole discussion.
Well, you've answered my question in the sense that
Sorry.
Oppenheimer's view was of that sort of, that way of looking at the world around us.
Shut up.
The nobility of labour is actually as multifaceted as an idea as the landscape is, in a way, isn't it? That labour is not at all noble if you're a miner coughing your guts up, having worked underground in the dust.
I think that was Berger's point, really.
Yeah. But on the other hand, if it's putting food on the table of your children, if it's making the world that we all live in, it has its nobility as well. More. Robert MacDonald, one of the landscape painters.
Max Ernst used to tell the story, as on the point of cutting down trees. Max Ernst used to tell the story that his father, who was an amateur painter, was sitting in front of the landscape outside the house one day, and got very frustrated and went into the house and got an axe. And he chopped down this large tree in front of the house because it destroyed, he thought it spoiled the view of his painting. So there's one way approach to chopping down trees. But I think on the topic of landscape, there's great contempt in the art establishment towards landscape painting on the whole. I used to write art criticism, and I had a long fracas with Adrian Searle, who wrote in in one of the newspapers that London Critic, of course, that there'd be no significant landscape painting of any relevance to art during the last 50 years. And, you know, he more or less said that people just don't paint landscapes anymore, and if they do, they're wasting their time. And I pointed out to him that, of course, Auerbach and there are so many other artists who have drawn inspiration from landscape. But there is this whole, I think it's a metropolitan thing, that somehow, of course, painting landscape, you're in an emotional relationship with the landscape itself. And this is totally opposed to the cool approach to painting these days, that painting is not is an intellectual activity. And if you're, I know when I've been painting landscape, I go up on the hill and paint landscape. And I used to live in a cottage up in the Brecon Beacons, and I would spent a lot of time painting outside. And I did find when I went home that I've never had an LSD trip, but you did feel you'd been on an LSD trip. Everything seemed somehow totally different because you had opened up that other side of the pathway of the brain, really, the left-hand side. Or is it right-hand side? But you're seeing things differently. And you need to do this looking and experiencing and opening yourself up, which Dan does amazingly well. But I do think there's a terrible struggle anybody involved in landscape painting has nowadays to make the world see that what they're doing is relevant. It's somehow dismissed by such a large portion of the art world.
I think Dan should comment on that. Dan, there's no sign of coolness in your paintings. There might be some sign of LSD trips, but would you like to tell?
Well, I think, frankly, as anyone has made any progress or ground with painting, anything, frankly, that ignores those sorts of ideas, which you know, it's individualistic. It's something which it's a life that you decide to embark on. When you're exploring images or words, and I think that is something that's a solitary activity. And you know, you're not opening up the thing for discussion. You're not saying, well, can we have everyone's input in this, and let's decide that's a sort of democratic idea of what this is, because it's not for everyone else. It's solely for the individual's activity. And you know, first of all, for many reasons, it could be for suggesting about some kind of discovery. In the landscape, it could be about some personal journey, a voyage, an emotional journey. There's so many things it can be, and to dismiss the subject of landscape as something which is backward or somehow parochial is, well, of course it's nonsense, because you just have to look round, as you say, the Tate, and you can look at any contemporary art exhibition, you can pick out landscapes. If you go down to the Eisteddfod, you see the work that's there in the amongst all of the selected exhibitors. There's landscape present in all of it. How can you say it's not current and contemporary?
Just a little thing about observation and landscape, really. I've evolved a peculiar way of working that I don't look at what I'm painting. So I was doing a series of paintings of Angkor slate from memory. And I made the mistake of going there. And it's just overwhelming. Too much. You know, too much information, too many hedgerows, little cottages, every damn thing in creation. So, the same with Gower, I was doing a series of Worm's Head. I didn't go near the place for about 5 years because I need to filter it through what I remember. And I found out long after I got involved in this process that that's what Chinese artists used to do in some dynasty. They'd go walking in the mountains, and then a couple of weeks later they get brush out. But my question really is about, you know, I can't imagine a poet sitting in the landscape thinking, I must just get this down. And you know, observations on writing poetry and landscape.
Yeah, sorry, I'm only sort of jumping in because I spent quite a lot of last summer sitting on Worm's Head, trying to get it down. But But that said, I completely identify with the process that you're talking about there, in that both in poetry and actually even more so in prose, every landscape that I have written about, I've always found myself writing about it actually out of the geography of that place. I found myself trying to bring the Zimbabwean veld off the page in Wales, and then Wales off the page in London, and then London off the page in New York. And I think there's a very real reason why that happens. I mean, I think it was Hobbes who said that the imagination and the memory are one and the same thing. And for me, I think as long as you have been there and you have had that experience of a place, and of course I hadn't been to Worm's Head before, which is why I had to sit there and try and get it down, but as long as you have had that, I think there's something incredibly rich in writing through the prism of memory. And it's partly about the license it gives you, and I think it's about the ability to access the sense over the knowing. So having sat on Worm's Head, I didn't actually write about it, you're right, until about a month later, and that was only because there was a deadline. I think ideally I would have left that distillation of memory even longer.
No, you can.
No.
Well, I was going to say an interesting thing about this that I thought about giving you my little 5 minutes in terms of this, changed my mind, but I'll mention it now. The seminal poem of the landscape movement as it was coming out of Wales in the 18th century was written by a painter. That's John Dyer's Gronga Hill. Now, Dyer trained in London as a painter with the absolute cutting-edge avant-garde Jonathan Richardson, painter Richardson. But he's almost entirely forgotten as a painter now. Not much of his work actually survives. But Gronga Hill, which was written in 1722, 3, something like that, became the seminal poem which influenced so many people, especially in England. And then subsequently, the poem that took over from that was James Thomson's The Seasons, which was written a little bit later. And those two together really shaped the mindset of English intellectuals. The interesting thing is Dyer was Welsh, Thomson was Scottish, which may have some relevance to that. But actually the direct point about the reason I'm butting in now is because when Dyer wrote Gronga Hill, he didn't publish it. He then went to Italy, and he was in Italy for 2 years, and his experience there would come out much later in a poem called The Ruins of Rome. But it wasn't until after he came back from Italy and reworked, Gronga Hill is a hill just outside near Sandalo, where he came from, and reworked Gronga Hill from memory in Italy, and then came back and published it, which is what you're both saying, I think. It's that process of filtration, and it can sometimes, I don't think Gronga Hill was published until 1740s. So it took a bloody long time. But it's that filtration process, the internalising of the landscape. What are you going to do with it? What do I feel about this? What does my audience need to know about it? Whatever your particular bent is, and then it can come out. But I think that's more usual way of proceeding than rather sort of getting it down, as you say, sitting in front of it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true in terms of the visual detail is what I got by sitting there and trying to get it. But the poem, if it is a poem, and what the poem wants to say, which was found in that landscape, all of that had to happen afterwards and also elsewhere.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Stunned silence.
Any more?
That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Could I just ask, sorry, I can't stand up when you speak. In relation to what you just said, do you think that experiencing something that is like Wales but not Wales actually crystallises what you feel about the landscape? I mean, I was thinking particularly of, my sister lived in Zimbabwe for years, and there's an area there where they all Welsh people in Zimbabwe say, oh, this is just like Wales. It's not like Wales when I look at it. And it pushes forward my idea of my Wales, if you like, or Wales in my head, and makes it clearer. Have you found that experiencing the other, that is like Wales but not Wales, if that makes any sense, pushes the real Wales forward in any way? Or is that too abstruse?
No, I think it's true for a lot of artists and people that happens, that you find. I had a strange experience of working in Herefordshire, which blends into Wales, but I couldn't find any of Wales in Herefordshire, strangely enough, which is not answering your question at all. I'm sorry, but I think it happens. I think it happens to us all, though. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a recall, a kind of visual and emotional recall, wherever you are.
It's interesting you picked up on Zimbabwe, because there's a specific case where precisely that happened in precisely that place, because Llywelyn Hall, when he was a young man, went to Zimbabwe on an Arts Council grant and came back and produced, I think, it's the high point of his career, I think, the images that he produced when he came back, which were a kind of synthesis of what he'd found in Zimbabwe and what that released to him, or enabled him to release what he felt about Wales. So it's a very specific example of precisely what you said.
Yes.
I think also the interesting phrase in your question was that idea of the real Wales, because I think, even with a very small country, which yes does have this incredible spectrum of landscape, it's very hard to define what the real Wales is, and that brings us back to the central conversation, that the idea of what a real Wales is partly formed in what we see, via art and poetry and film, and it's up for change, it's up for debate. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that before Wordsworth wrote Tintern Abbey and that period of the Romantic painters as well, people weren't going around, and seeing old ruins as a beautiful thing. And then at the other end of that process, that's become a marker. I mean, it's now become something of a cliche, but of what a beautiful landscape is. So I think, because having travelled to places like Zimbabwe and had that experience, actually what it's done for me, rather than push the real Wales to the fore, it's just sent me back to that question as to actually what is the real Welsh landscape, and how much is it formed by the tunnel vision of that moment, I suppose.
This whole business of creating what we'd say in painting is a national school, which I described, for instance, with the attempt to bring all those painters together in the immediate post-war period under the banner of Welsh environmentalism. There's a constant tension going on between the need for critics and historians, and perhaps some painters as well, and some poets as well, to see themselves in a national context. But when I look at it and look back at even that immediate post-war period, what I see is incredible diversity. So these things are after the event constructs very often, and of course that isn't to say it doesn't matter. Actually, that's what matters most, bizarrely, because especially with painting, we tend to be conditioned as much as by what people have said about paintings, what they write about paintings, and where they're fitted into a tradition, as we are looking at the paintings. I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? Well, perhaps it isn't a problem. It's the same as looking at a landscape, looking at a painting, isn't it? You bring your baggage to it. And if your baggage happens to be a national agenda...
No, it's a massive problem. I was just looking at that show yesterday, looking at those wonderful drawings by... Bert Isaac.
Yeah, they're lovely.
And I was looking at the ink work, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder if he was thinking about this artist at the time. Was he playing? Did he almost? It's always a problem, I think, sometimes if you go to exhibitions frequently and familiar with their artist. It's something of a curse, and it is baggage. You feel as though you are carrying your sacks with you, and how do you shrug these people off and sort of just trying very hard to ignore, and you can feel the twist of a brush, the turn of a nib or something. You think, oh my God, I'm back to Sutherland, I'm back to so and so. How do I get away from these people? And I think the only way to get away from them is this activity, this timeless pursuit of going into the land and just sitting there and working through these problems and drawing yourself out of it, writing yourself out of it. And weirdly, it does happen. It happens every single time. And when you're living away from the landscape, such as this, around here, this beautiful place, in some ways it's very overbearing. When you've been living in the city and you come back to it fresh, and you come with this baggage, particularly I think if you live in a city, and then you're intimidated by it. You think, what can I do? What am I going to do here that's going to be, what angle do I come at from this? And the only way you do it, like I say, I think it's just working through it. It's simple, and that's the only you can only get that by being in the landscape.
I wonder if you ever have artists doing...
Sure.
Sorry. So was there a question?
I was just going to say that's a good point to stop.
It probably is. It probably is. I've just got one question, because I was just struck, because I've since we moved back, I've been living in the Beacons, and every weekend we see people come in to experience that landscape as an escape, a release. I just wondered if there's a similar flow of rural artists, going into London and Manchester and Birmingham, and sitting there and going, this is different to me, this is exciting, this is a release, this is quite overwhelming. What do I make of it? And if we don't, why not?
David Tress is an interesting example of somebody on the west of Wales who's absolutely loves the coast and the hills, but has done some very productive painting in London and New York, looking at those canyons of buildings and those windy streets in the same fashion.
Yeah, well, it is amazing image of Harlech Castle, one of his fantastic paintings. It's such an urban painting.
Yes.
It's Harlech Castle, and the main thing in the foreground is something, I can't remember what the sign says, but it says hot dogs, 50p. Yes. Fantastic, wonderful landscape painting. So yeah, it's the answer.
I'm going to explain two things that are happening next now. In fact, three things that are happening next. One is that the three writers here, and I also as the writer of the catalogue, will be available for a little while downstairs. If you go out down inside, books are for sale, and you may persuade these people to sign them. You don't need to persuade me, but you might have to hold back. You don't want it spoiled. The next thing that's going to happen is that at 6:30, the exhibition opening takes place over at the Artshop. Six. Of Dan's paintings here and there, and three other artists of the landscape as well. And the last thing that I'm going to mention is that Paul Henry is going to read a final poem.
Right.
Which you've forgotten.
I thought I got away with that. Right. Actually, I suppose this carries on the idea of an inner, deeper landscape, but it's the riverscape of the Usk in Crickhowell. Under the river. Under the river, a deeper river runs. It is simply a case of pressing your ear, your heart to the bank, about here, then of listening to its quieter turns, to the voices of loved ones you thought would never rise again, holding you now with an old refrain. Under the river, a deeper river runs. Into the dimming light, the fish stone, the flit spirits, the singing well, the sudden bleat festival. And the white manor's sloping lawn is a tennis court on the run. Rain salts its lines, makes bullseyes of trout kisses. Oh, 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 into the dimming light, the fish stone. Some of us are ghosts before we die, dressing too darkly in summer, following church bells in winter, down crumbling staircases of sky, to the river where a deeper river lies. About here, hush, they are singing well tonight, as we are singing still, though some of us are ghosts before we die.